Let me tell you something most people never realize until it's too late. You don't lose an empath in a single moment. You lose them in the silence you ignored while they were still trying. They don't leave loudly. They don't announce it. They don't create drama or demand attention. Instead, they quietly start pulling back while still showing up for you. They still listen. They still care. They still give you chances, but something in their energy begins to shift. It's subtle at first. A little less explanation, a little less patience, a little more distance in their eyes, even when they're physically present, and you don't notice it because everything still looks fine on the surface. But internally, they're already processing something powerful. They're deciding whether staying is still worth the emotional cost. And here's what most people miss. An empath doesn't leave when they're hurt the most. They leave when they finally feel nothing anymore. Because once that emotional switch turns off, there's no more arguing, no more pleading, no more trying, just silence. An empath doesn't disappear suddenly the way people assume. There is no single breaking point that you can point to and say, that's when they left. What actually happens is far quieter, far slower, and far more dangerous to the relationship. It's a withdrawal that begins long before anyone notices. At first, it doesn't look like anything serious. They're still present, still responding, still showing up in the ways they always have. But what changes is not their presence, it's their emotional availability. And that shift is so subtle that most people completely miss it. An empath lives in emotional depth. They don't just hear words, they absorb tone, energy, intention, and unspoken meaning. So when they care about someone, they are fully engaged, mentally and emotionally. They're not halfway in, they're all in. And that's exactly why their withdrawal is not loud or dramatic. It's gradual, almost invisible at the beginning. It starts with fatigue that has nothing to do with physical tiredness. It's emotional exhaustion built from repeated cycles of giving, understanding, adjusting, and absorbing without receiving the same level of care in return. They don't usually complain about it. In fact, they often minimize it even to themselves. They tell themselves things like, it's fine, I can handle it, or maybe they don't realize how it affects me. They justify, they rationalize, they over-understand. But emotional capacity is not infinite. Even for someone deeply empathetic, there is a threshold where giving starts to cost more than it returns. And once that internal balance begins to tilt too far in one direction, something inside them quietly starts to shut down, not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of preservation. This is where the withdrawal begins. They don't suddenly stop caring. They start caring slightly less in small, almost unnoticeable ways. They reply a little slower. They explain a little less. They stop repeating themselves when they feel unheard. They stop trying to fix misunderstandings that keep happening in loops. Not because they don't value the relationship anymore, but because they are running out of emotional energy to keep repairing something that keeps breaking in the same places. To the outside eye, nothing seems wrong. That's the most deceptive part. Everything still looks functional, conversations still happen, laughs still happen, presence is still there. But internally, something is shifting into self-protection mode. An empath doesn't leave emotionally because of one big betrayal or one massive argument. They leave emotionally after a long accumulation of being misunderstood, emotionally drained, or taken for granted in small, repeated ways. Each moment alone feels insignificant, but together they form a weight that eventually becomes too heavy to carry, and instead of exploding outward, they turn inward. They start reflecting more than reacting. They start observing instead of engaging. They begin to detach not because they want to hurt the other person, but because they are trying to stop hurting themselves. This is the stage most people fail to recognize. Because there is no confrontation, they assume everything is still okay. But what they don't see is that the empath has already started the process of emotional separation while still physically present. They begin to protect their energy in ways they didn't need to before. They stop over-explaining, they stop over-giving, they stop over-investing in outcomes that never seem to change. And slowly, without announcing it, they begin to build distance. Not physical distance, but emotional distance. And emotional distance is the real beginning of disappearance. Because once an empath disconnects internally, their actions outside start to change naturally. They become quieter, not cold but reserved, not hostile but detached. Their warmth doesn't vanish instantly, it fades. And that fading is what confuses people the most, because it doesn't feel like rejection at first. It just feels like they're a little off. But what's actually happening is deeper than that. They are emotionally conserving what little energy they have left. They are no longer pouring themselves into places where they feel consistently unseen or unvalued. They are quietly stepping back from emotional labor that no longer feels mutual. And the most important thing to understand is this. By the time you notice the change in them, they have already gone through a long internal process of letting go. Not letting go of the person immediately, but letting go of the expectation, the hope, the emotional investment. The idea that things will eventually balance out if they just try a little harder. That's what really drains an empath, the constant belief that things will improve paired with the repeated experience that they don't. So they withdraw, not in one moment, not in one decision, but in layers after layer of emotional exhaustion being peeled back into silence. And once that silence becomes comfortable for them, that's when the real separation begins, because at that point they are no longer fighting to stay connected. They are simply preparing to no longer need to. When an empath stops caring, it is never random and it is never impulsive. It is the result of a long internal process where patience, understanding, and emotional endurance have been pushed past their natural limit. What looks like sudden indifference on the outside is actually the final stage of something that has been building quietly for a long time. An empath doesn't start from a place of detachment. They start from deep emotional investment. They notice everything. They feel everything. They try to understand what others miss, and they often take responsibility for emotional balance in relationships even when it is not their job to do so. At the beginning, this feels natural to them. Caring feels like connection. Giving feels like love. Understanding feels like purpose, but over time, something begins to shift when that care is not met with equal awareness or effort from the other side. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment, it happens in accumulation. Small emotional disappointments stack up quietly. Moments where they were misunderstood, dismissed, or emotionally overlooked don't always create visible conflict, but they create internal weight. And the empath carries that weight silently. They don't immediately withdraw because their first instinct is always to try harder, to understand deeper, to fix what feels off. They ask themselves questions first. Did I misunderstand them? Am I expecting too much? Can I adjust more? This self-reflection is part of their nature, but it also becomes part of what drains them over time, because in trying to maintain harmony, they often overextend themselves emotionally. They give explanations when silence would protect them. They offer patience when distance would be healthier. They stay longer in situations where their emotional needs are consistently overlooked. And while they are doing all of this, something important is happening internally. They are recording everything, not in a calculated or manipulative way, but in an emotional memory system that quietly tracks patterns. They remember how many times they had to repeat themselves. They remember how many times they felt unheard. They remember how often they were the one adjusting while the other remained unchanged. At first, these memories are softened by hope, hope that things will improve. Hope that understanding will eventually become mutual. Hope that effort will eventually be reciprocated. This hope is what keeps them engaged far longer than most people realize. But hope is not infinite. There comes a point where hope starts competing with experience. And when experience keeps repeating the same emotional imbalance, hope begins to weaken. That is where the internal shift begins, not loudly, not suddenly, but decisively. An empath doesn't wake up one day and decide, I don't care anymore. Instead, they slowly arrive at the realization that caring has not been protecting them. It has been depleting them. And this realization changes everything. Because when an empath reaches this point, they begin to emotionally step back as a form of self-preservation. It starts subtly. They stop over-explaining their feelings. They stop initiating emotional repair conversations that never seem to lead anywhere different. They stop investing energy into trying to make someone understand something they have already explained multiple times. This is not cruelty. It is exhaustion. What people often misinterpret as coldness is actually emotional conservation. The empath is no longer willing to spend energy in places where that energy repeatedly disappears without acknowledgement or return, and this is where the true turning point happens. When an empath stops caring, it is not a collapse of emotion, it is the end of emotional overextension. It is the moment they stop trying to hold together something that requires both sides to participate but has only been carried by one. From the outside, this can feel sudden. One day they are responsive, engaged, emotionally available. Then gradually they become quieter, more distant, less reactive, less invested in outcomes that once mattered deeply to them. But internally, this is not sudden at all. It is the final expression of a long decision that has already been made in layers over time, because before they stop caring outwardly, they stop expecting inwardly. And that is the real beginning of emotional detachment. Once expectations disappear, emotional attachment begins to dissolve naturally. They no longer wait for change in the same way. They no longer anticipate emotional reciprocity. They no longer interpret inconsistency as something that will eventually fix itself. Instead, they accept it. And acceptance is where emotional distance is born. At this stage, the empath is no longer reacting from emotion. They are responding from awareness. They are no longer trying to correct the pattern. They are observing it from a place of clarity. And clarity is dangerous for relationships that depend on emotional imbalance to function because it removes illusion. When illusion is gone, so is emotional dependency. And what remains is truth, the truth that effort was not balanced. The truth that emotional needs were not consistently met. The truth that they were carrying more than their share for too long. And once an empath sees this clearly, they don't argue with it. They don't fight to rewrite it. They simply adjust their position in response to it. That adjustment is what people later describe as they stopped caring. But in reality, it is not the absence of care. It is the end of overcare. They are no longer willing to give beyond what is reciprocated. No longer willing to emotionally overextend themselves to maintain connections that require imbalance to survive. And once that boundary is set internally, it becomes very difficult to reverse, because by the time an empath reaches this state, they are not reacting emotionally anymore. They are operating from clarity, self-respect, and emotional protection. And that is why when an empath stops caring, it feels so final. Not because their capacity to care is gone, but because their willingness to lose themselves in the process of caring has already ended. Most people don't realize they are losing an empath until it's already too late, and the reason for that is simple. They were never paying attention to the quiet signals that came long before the silence. Empaths rarely announce their pain in obvious ways. They don't create dramatic warnings or emotional ultimatums. Instead, they communicate their exhaustion in subtle shifts that are easy to overlook if you're not emotionally aware. At the beginning, everything still feels normal on the surface. Conversations continue, smiles continue, presence continues. But beneath that surface, something very different is happening. The empath is slowly starting to observe more and express less. They begin to notice patterns that others might dismiss, but they cannot ignore. Because for them, emotional truth is not something they can unsee once they recognize it. What people fail to understand is that empaths process relationships deeply and continuously. They are constantly analyzing emotional balance, who is giving, who is taking, where effort is being invested, and where it is being ignored. This is not done consciously every second, but it becomes a natural internal awareness that shapes how they feel in a relationship over time. So when imbalance starts to occur repeatedly, they don't immediately react. Instead, they start adapting. At first, they try harder, they explain more clearly, they give more patience, they extend more understanding. They fill in emotional gaps without being asked because they want things to work. They believe effort can restore balance, but the problem is not a lack of effort on their part. It is the absence of recognition on the other side, and that is where the silent breakdown begins. The empath starts to reduce what they naturally give, not all at once, but gradually. They stop repeating themselves when they feel unheard. They stop over-explaining their emotions when they realize those emotions are being minimized or misunderstood. They stop investing energy into conversations that feel one-sided or repetitive in outcome. To the other person, this reduction is often invisible at first. It doesn't look like withdrawal. It looks like they're just quiet today, or they seem a bit off. But what is actually happening is emotional recalibration. The empath is adjusting their level of investment to match what they are receiving. And this adjustment is the first signal most people miss. Another early signal is emotional neutrality. Empaths are naturally expressive, emotionally responsive, and deeply engaged in connection. So when they begin to become emotionally neutral in situations where they used to be reactive or expressive, that is a major internal shift. It means they are no longer fully emotionally invested in the outcome of interactions the way they once were. But instead of recognizing this as a warning, most people interpret it incorrectly. They assume everything is fine because there is no conflict, no argument, no visible breakdown. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is detachment forming. One of the clearest but least recognized signals is when the empath stops initiating emotional repair. In the past, they would be the ones trying to fix misunderstandings, clarify confusion, or restore emotional balance after tension. They would reach out, they would explain. They would try to reconnect emotionally. But as they begin to withdraw internally, they stop doing this. Not because they don't care about resolution, but because they realize that resolution without change leads nowhere. So they conserve their energy instead of continuing cycles that do not evolve. This is often the moment where the relationship begins to unknowingly deteriorate, because repair is no longer being initiated, and yet from the outside, everything still looks stable. That is why so many people only recognize the loss after it happens. They were never looking for emotional absence in behavior. They were waiting for dramatic evidence that never came. Another subtle signal is emotional simplification. The empath stops going into deep emotional explanations. They stop trying to make the other person understand complex emotional perspectives. Instead, their communication becomes shorter, simpler, and more detached. Not because they lack depth, but because they no longer feel the need to express it where it is not received or valued. This is where the disconnect grows silently. Because while the empath is withdrawing emotionally, the other person often continues operating as if nothing has changed. They still assume availability. They still assume understanding. They still assume emotional access will always be there. But the empath is already shifting inward. They are beginning to prioritize emotional safety over emotional availability. And that shift is irreversible once it takes hold. The most important thing to understand is that empaths don't leave when they are overwhelmed. They leave when they stop believing emotional effort will lead to emotional balance. That belief is what keeps them engaged for so long. When it disappears, their presence changes permanently, and by the time most people notice the difference, the empath has already gone through a full internal process of detachment, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in clarity, because they finally see the pattern for what it is. Repeated emotional imbalance without meaningful change, and once that clarity sets in, they stop waiting for things to become different. They simply accept what has already been happening for a long time. That acceptance is what creates the illusion of sudden disappearance. But in reality, it was never sudden. It was just unnoticed, and that is why most people realize it too late. When an empath becomes silent, what you are witnessing is not confusion, not emotional instability, and not a temporary withdrawal. You are witnessing clarity. And clarity, once reached, is one of the most final emotional states a person can enter. Empaths don't arrive at silence quickly. They don't shut down overnight. They don't suddenly decide to detach without reason. Their silence is built slowly, layer by layer, through repeated emotional experiences that eventually lead them to a point where speaking, explaining, or engaging no longer feels necessary. At first, they are expressive. They communicate, they explain, they try to bridge gaps. They believe that understanding can fix almost anything if both people are willing. So they invest heavily in emotional connection. They listen deeply. They give space for others to be understood. And in doing so, they often become the emotional stabilizer in relationships without ever being asked to take that role. But over time, something changes. Not in their ability to feel, but in their willingness to keep expressing what repeatedly goes unnoticed, misunderstood, or unreciprocated. They start noticing patterns that don't improve no matter how much effort they put in. They start recognizing cycles that repeat without resolution. And most importantly, they start feeling the emotional cost of being the one who always has to bridge the gap. That is where silence begins to form, not as an action, but as a response. At first, it is subtle. They talk less about their inner world. They stop sharing every emotional detail. They reduce explanations that once felt important, not because they no longer care, But because they begin to understand that care alone is not enough if it is not met with equal awareness, this is where most people misinterpret what is happening. They assume everything is still fine because there is no conflict, no confrontation, no emotional breakdown. But silence is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of conclusion forming quietly inside someone who has already processed too much. And that is the key difference with an empath's silence. It is not reactive, it is reflective. They are not reacting to a single moment. They are responding to a long accumulation of moments that have already shaped their internal decision. Once that internal shift happens, something very important changes. They stop needing validation for their perception. Before, they might have questioned themselves. They might have tried to explain more, to be understood more clearly. But once clarity sets in, they stop debating their own experience. They stop trying to convince others of what they already know internally. That is when silence becomes powerful. Because now silence is not avoidance. It is confirmation. An empath in this state no longer speaks to fix emotional imbalance. They observe it. They understand it. But they no longer feel responsible for correcting it. That responsibility has been released not out of resentment, but out of emotional exhaustion, turning into emotional acceptance. And acceptance is irreversible. This is why their silence feels different. It is not loud with emotion. It is not reactive with anger. It is calm, steady, and detached. And that calmness can be unsettling to others because it carries finality without explanation. In the past, silence might have meant they were hurt and waiting to be reached out to. But once clarity is reached, silence means something entirely different. It means they are no longer waiting. They are no longer seeking resolution in the same dynamic. They are no longer emotionally invested in repeating cycles that have already shown their outcome. And most importantly, they are no longer expecting change to come from the same place that caused the imbalance. This is where emotional separation becomes real, not physical separation, not dramatic exit, but internal departure while still physically present for a period of time. This is why many people don't notice it immediately. Because the empath is still there, but not in the way they used to be. Their body remains, but their emotional engagement has already stepped back. And this is where silence becomes the strongest indicator of all. Because when an empath is emotionally engaged, even if they are quiet, there is still presence in their energy. There is still responsiveness, still emotional connection behind their words and reactions. But when clarity has taken over, even their presence feels different. It becomes neutral, observational, detached without hostility. At this stage, they are no longer trying to communicate emotional depth to someone who hasn't consistently met them there. They are conserving emotional energy for themselves. They are redirecting their focus inward rather than outward. And this inward shift is what makes their silence final. Because it is no longer about what others are doing. It is about what they have already understood. They understand the pattern. They understand the dynamic. They understand the outcome of continuing the same emotional investment without change. And once that understanding settles, there is no longer a need for further emotional discussion. That is why silence becomes the conclusion rather than the beginning of distance. And this is the part most people realize too late. They assume silence is an invitation to reconnect. But in the empath's world, silence after clarity is not an invitation. It is closure, not spoken closure, not explained closure. But internal closure that does not require external validation. By the time this stage is reached, the empath is no longer emotionally negotiating their place in the relationship. They are no longer asking for change. They are no longer waiting for understanding. They have already understood everything they needed to. And that understanding is what makes their silence so final. Because once someone no longer needs to explain themselves, no longer needs to be understood, and no longer needs emotional reciprocity to feel complete in their decision, they are no longer halfway in, they are already out. In the end, losing an empath is never about one moment. It's about all the moments that were ignored, the times they stayed quiet instead of arguing, the times they understood you instead of being understood, the times they gave more while receiving less and still chose to stay until they didn't. Because when an empath finally stops caring, it's not anger you're dealing with, it's clarity. A clear decision that they've already given everything they could, and there's nothing left to prove, explain, or fix. And that's why their absence feels so final, not because they left suddenly, but because they left completely long before you noticed.